that was our topic. I feel like I can hold up the FA Cup. My boyhood dream realised. There's quite a lot of crossovers, I think, with design, or so we thought. But actually, perhaps we've looked at other areas. But anyway, that was our topic. I'm not going to read it out. Nothing worse than anybody reading out a slide, is there? But, so, we ended up with 3 principles. We sort of picked one each of our favourite things that we talked about in the half an hour. So we'll do those individually. So, I don't know if anyone can see this. Are these sticky? No. Just glance down the piece of paper. I'm just going to shout out some things. We talked obviously about how we can involve private sector. We talked about consistency and personalisation. Choice and quality was a topic we discussed. Data protection and the knock-on effect of security. We talked about the principle of having a consistent tone of voice. So that was a real usability principle, because we talked about all sorts of things that perhaps weren't usability principles. We talked about how to fall into and avoid silo thinking, local and national themes, and whether or not government has a competitor, which makes it very different to the private sector. And we talked about growing trust, crowdsourcing, and other such interesting topics. If anybody feels like they want to speak on one now, feel free.
Well, we kind of spent a quarter of an hour going, these things were really interesting tensions, when we realised we just identified the problems but phrased them in a slightly different way again. So we thought we'd try and focus on the 3 things which were maybe closer to a way forward.
Yeah, we had a go at the hows, didn't we, as well? So you both asked me about whether or not we had case studies in DirectGov that prove the point about why you'd want to do this. And I was going to mention that to you, Harry, when you shouted out your comment. So we are lucky enough to have a couple of good case studies, examples of when you don't do it a certain way, bad things happen, and then when you do it this way, the numbers shoot up. There's no more powerful thing than that you can have. You can have the best set of standards written, beautifully designed, but if you've got a good, solid case study, then things start to change. We've noticed that in DirectGov.
What are those case studies?
I was about to ask that. Are DWP sharing those case studies?
There we go. They are being shared with on the channel strategy work with Smarter Government at the moment.
Broadly, I think they will be available. But broadly, it was basically looking at how many people could get through a service just before it was about to go live, which was very low, maybe 1 or 2%, I think were the numbers. Then we applied some user-centered design principles to it, redesigned it from the bottom up, and got the numbers up to around 60-70%. Doesn't look particularly fancy, wouldn't stand out in anybody's design portfolio, but people get through it. We talked about obviously having a set of standards that people could use. Whose standards that don't ask me the question of whose standards they are, because that's just a horrible question to ask and I'll avoid it. But having some government standards, and I know there are some out there and they're very useful. The role of academic.
I'm not so sure that they're all useful. Having spent the best part of the last 2 months reading through the COI standards for public sector websites, and the sheer amount of paper they seem to require being produced, I'm not entirely sure that some of the standards that are already there are of any use at all.
Okay. So the door that might be Alex walking.
In true
timing was just a bit too good.
In true Paul Clark fashion, I'll take that on board and I'll move on to the next point.
We did talk about that, because we talked about trying to kind of get beyond the idea of just standards to which standards were cool and which standards really could be replicated and applied across the patch, and in which places they should be applied. And actually, for me, that kind of is about not just national but local and third sector and private sector if it's in this terrain, because these are a set of things which, if you're going user focus, you have to look at from a user's point of view. But if there's lots of stuff in there that isn't cool, then it shouldn't be this. It's about making the standards better and more usable and more core, I think.
What do other service designers think about standards? Do they get in the way? Do they just give you more and more piles of to trip up? Surely the good stuff just works. Do you really need all this effort on standards? What do small, agile innovators think, Harry?
Some standards are useful. Some standards are a pain in the balls. And
Limit it to a sheet of A4. One sheet of A4. One sheet of A4. It's an interesting message, because if this does emerge as a principle that people here think is good, be careful of what you wish for. You want lots of standards, or you want robust standards, firm standards, rigid standards, inflexible standards?
I think you need flexible standards is exactly it, right? I mean, people have been banging on about writing valid HTML for blogs, and they're all right, and you should do it, but ultimately, if you want to do something, and the quality of your user experience revolves around using or not using a font tag, then for God's sake, use it. You need to be focused on the users and on what works, and if your brand guidelines actually are so restrictive that you end up producing a poorer product than if you didn't have them, you've ended up in a very strange place indeed. So I think it's important to have standards, but they should be guidelines, and they should be overridable if you have good reasons.
Doesn't it depend on who the standards are aimed at? I mean, if they're aimed at you guys, you obviously, I mean, you're involved in design for a living, you want to produce a product which is of a high quality, and maybe you've got some sort of intuitive knowledge about what standards should apply. Whereas if it's sort of for someone within civil service who maybe isn't from a design background, they're going to need more standards, and you guys probably don't need any standards really, because you know the standards. So you're not really the target for a set of standards.
You'd be surprised how the most obvious simple standard can be completely misinterpreted,
Yeah.
and then actually ends up with a worse experience. That's probably a conversation.
So isn't it more about people than standards in a way? It's,
I think that's right, because standards are things that everybody else needs to comply with. So Harry doesn't just comply with standards because he knows he's got a really good reason for not complying with it, and he's probably right. And we all have very good reasons for not complying with bits of standards that are inconvenient to us. And at the level of the individual decision, all of those may well be right, but then they add up to something where you've suddenly got yourself an incoherent and inconsistent set of stuff going on. So there are two questions. One is, does this particular thing work for the user or not, if I do or do not comply with the standard? But there's an equally important question, which is, how does this contribute to the whole set of things which the whole set of users experiences? And that can be quite a hard balance, because there's no source to each you can go to find out what